Welcome to Radio Free Fresno, the only podcast coming to you from the south of Shaw. In this episode, we're going to be continuing with the series Fascism in America with Dr. Lars Maischak. So, Dr. Lars Maischak, what is fascism?
People throw the term around to say, my driving instructor was a total Nazi, for instance, or you associate it with Europe, with the Germans, with people who are weird and foreign. So the idea that this could be something that has any relevance at all to the mainstream of American political life, apart from people who we dismiss as cosplayers, like the American Nazi Party that marched through towns in Illinois in the 1970s to universal ridicule, which, however, established pretty important precedent for the way we define freedom of speech today by the Supreme Court. Nevertheless, it seems like literally utterly un-American. So this is sort of, besides, we were the good guys. When it comes to the Nazis, we won, beat them in 1945. So clearly we were the enemies of the Nazis. There can be no connection. This is sort of the dismissal, right? You don't have to deal with it because it's clearly nothing to do with us. The other thing is to use it as a convenient slur. So on the internet, the idea was for a long time, you call somebody a fascist just because you disagree with them. So because that sometimes happens, or because that commonly happened, therefore the reasoning goes, you can't call anybody a fascist legitimately because it's always an overstatement. A serious argument for why you shouldn't call somebody a Nazi or a fascist that I have heard is that it diminishes the unique horror of German National Socialism, as it liked to be known among its friends, or fascism, because starting World War II, systematically killing 6 million people because of their religion, which of course to the Nazis, Jews were also a race. It was a mass murder on racist grounds. They didn't think that you could stop being Jewish by converting. So it was about the inherent traits of a group of people that they thought they needed to annihilate to make the world a better place, as it were. That becomes a grounds for saying you can't call anybody a fascist, because if you do, you're diminishing the unique suffering of these people. And you have to acknowledge the singularity of the Holocaust. As a German, I very much believe that is true. You have to acknowledge the singular evil that the Holocaust represents. So I don't throw around the term Nazi lightly, but the term fascist is not the same thing. I mean, Nazi applies specifically to German fascism. And it's a whole nother debate among people, among historians like me, whether you can call the German National Socialist regime, the Hitler regime, fascist. Whether that is not in itself a mischaracterization, but I think it's clear enough that the three main Axis powers, Italy, Germany, and Japan, were driven by similar ideas about national greatness, about the right to expand, to subjugate lesser peoples who were conveniently sitting on important strategic resources for national industry, for slave labor, and so forth. So, yup, it is definitely fascist. That unites these. But that the misuses are not just about the ideology, because I would say what you want, if you really want to have a clear definition of what it is, and you sometimes see these lists online that include, say, militaristic foreign policy, an emphasis on masculinity and strength, a rejection of equality and of the rights of the labor movement and so forth. So this points to a kind of a mix. On the one hand, there is a political program, like not everybody who wants to crush unions is a fascist, but every fascist wants to crush unions. That is a question of political program. Then there is the question of political ideology, of worldview. Is there a coherent system of thought that informs the program? And I would argue with Trump, with Hitler, with those kinds of authoritarian leaders that people like to look at in isolation. You know, the way people talk about Trump, what a nutcase, what a buffoon. He is misleading all these people. He is an evil man, you know, the old orange man bad trope. The same way that people dismissed fascism in Germany by saying, oh, Hitler was mad. He was an evil man who took over. So that really diminishes the degree to which societies are calling for their fascist dictators, how they are in agreement with his goals, with his way of thinking, how they are living vicariously through him.
Yeah.
So this is a question of ideology. It is a question of having certain assumptions about the way that the world works that basically says not all people are created equal. There needs to be a clear order with people who are in charge and people who are taken charge of, as it were. For the most part, that means it's got to be min. If there is a racial component, I mean, German society was overwhelmingly white, if you will, before World War II. On the other hand, that doesn't mean that there wasn't racial and ethnic conflict. For instance, Polish and Danish ethnic groups were present in the German territory before World War I. And the conflict between ethnic Germans and the Danes and the Poles defines the German national identity to a great degree. So it's easy to miss that because in the United States, conveniently, ethnicity seems to be about skin color. But if you're Danish or Polish, your skin color doesn't look that different to a German, to an outsider. But it is definitely at the time in the 19th century when it defines German nationalism. So it is about assumptions about human inequality, about hierarchy, about social Darwinism, about the idea that poverty is something that is good if it happens to certain people, that struggle is something that ennobles, especially if others have to do it. But that also comes with a certain ruthlessness, the idea that if you are on top, if you can get what you want by force or by using power, that in itself is a justification. You know, Friedrich Nietzsche, the philosopher, is often blamed for part of this way of thinking with his term of the superhuman, the Übermensch, the idea which goes back to his book Beyond Good and Evil, where he basically says the Christian morality that says there is good and there is evil, and it's better to do good than to do evil. You ought not to do evil or else. And Nietzsche says there is no morality, there is only power. And if you have the power to force somebody to do something good for you, that gives you the right. So it's basically a philosophically complicated way of saying might makes right. It's a bit of a bastardization of Nietzsche to boil it down to that. Nevertheless, Nietzsche becomes the shorthand for this way of thinking. The will to power is a phrase that Nietzsche uses. The will to power becomes a catchphrase of Nazi Germany, to the point where it informs the title of that Leni Riefenstahl movie, that masterwork of Nazi propaganda about Adolf Hitler and the Nuremberg Party Rally, The Triumph of the Will, and the will that triumphs, where the idea manifests itself in the world through sheer force of will, is precisely proof of concept of that triumph of the will to power that Nietzsche talks about. So all the way to the end of World War II, there was this idea that many people believed in. We are going to win because we have the will. We have that iron will. And no matter that we have no resources and no boots and no uniforms and no weapons, and there is millions more soldiers on the Allied side, we're still going to win because we are just inherently superior. So this kind of philosophy, this militant idealism that is essentially about trying to conquer the individual and the body and so forth, that is very much at the heart of it all. So if you look at the response of the Republicans, sorry.
So like the rule of the ruthless kind of?
Yeah.
Okay.
Ruthlessness as a virtue. So if you look at the people who Trump pardoned, the war criminals, the butchers in uniform who went to Iraq and killed people, that is the classical example of a hero to a fascist. Somebody who just goes out there and does what needs to be done for the greater good, for the cause. Somebody who is not, my grandfather, the one of my two grandfathers, who was a fascist.
And the other one was communist?
He was a social democrat and a labor movement activist.
Okay.
And then his father-in-law had been a labor leader in a union and was an inmate in a concentration camp. So I have both sides.
There's both sides. Okay.
Both
just
sides
for people
in my family.
understand.
I know exactly what they're about. But on the Nazi side, my grandfather said, and this matches nicely with the view of Republicans themselves here, Americans lost the Vietnam War because they are too sentimental. And by sentimental, he meant they are driven by fluffy feelings for people and their rights and their values.
And their rights.
Yeah. So if you go and you don't see an enemy and you don't kill them in cold blood because you're somehow won over by these humanitarian or Christian or liberal or whatever Western notions of the inherent right of the individual, you lose. And you win if you can shed that sentimentality, that silly belief in the value of humans, of human lives.
So it is necessary to dehumanize in order to win a war, in order to progress, basically.
Yeah. And that is the insight.
To a fascist.
Yes. Well, not just to a fascist. If you look at the way that the US conduct of the war in Vietnam has been processed, the things that the massacre of My Lai, for instance, and the way that John Kerry, who was the one who blew the whistle on that and who went to Congress and spoke out against it, was vilified as a traitor by many of the people who had fought in Vietnam and who were fine with it, who thought that this was a good thing to do or not a bad thing. I mean, it's like same with the Holocaust denial. On the one hand, you're saying that didn't happen. And when you're saying that didn't happen, you're saying, but I thought it was a good thing that it happened. If it had happened, you shouldn't have anything against it. So that's driven by this cult of strength, by this will to power, by this ruthlessness. And so that would be another, this ideology is kind of, it's hard to separate from patriarchy. It's hard to separate from the appeal of a kind of, people call it toxic masculinity now. I think that is far too weak a concept, and it's kind of wishy-washy too. But there's a specific way of thinking and conducting yourself if you're a group of men with weapons that are out fighting an enemy and that are convinced of the worthlessness of that enemy, that has been described most notably by Klaus Teweleit. Sorry, my mind is on Teweleit now because I'm working on an essay on feminism as one of the main goals that the fascists have as beating. You know, they are anti-feminist at heart. Feminism is not by accident their main target, you know. And the whole rhetoric of softness, of snowflakes, of safe spaces, etc. That is all kind of coded in a feminine, soft kind of way, you know. Everything that the enemy represents. So the path-breaking study of where that comes from, and again, I recognize it in the way that people who talk about COVID and about masks and who are saying it's a hoax and it's not dangerous and you have to just be strong and go out there and, you know, we suffer through it and if you die, you die. That is Nazi talk. That is Nazi thinking.
Yeah.
So
it does sound a lot like the eugenics of, hey, if you catch it, it's your genes' fault. It's your poor whatever. Like that's how they're talking about it. Yeah.
One of
And
the
also, it almost seems like they want it to weed people out. Like that's kind
and
of.
some said that explicitly. Some of the COVID deniers, some of the anti-maskers are explicitly saying, yes, we want a culling of the herd. We want humanity to be reduced because the strong survive and the weak die. And that's the right thing to do, or that's the way to go. So I see the parallel in that way of thinking. And fate, this notion that a cold, unfeeling universe meets out people's paths of life without regard to good or evil. You know, what happens, happens.
Yeah.
Was so strong a concept in Nazi Germany. The idea that you don't fight it, you don't complain about it, you suffer your fate without complaint, and you do what's right and you do what's good, and you fight for people and Führer to the end, no matter how many people you've seen die. You see somebody die, you know, maybe do a brief thing to make them more comfortable and more dignified in their dead body, move on, forget they ever existed. So this kind of harshness, this kind of hardness and coldness is an inherent feature of this ideology, that social Darwinism, that cult of strength, that faith in a blind fate that informs the fascist mind. And even today with the clerical fascists who are saying, oh, but it's God's will and so forth. God is just a label, but the underlying idea here is the God they're talking about is not the Christian God. I mean, I don't believe in God one way or the other, but I know enough about Christianity to know that the Christian God is supposed to be a God of love and forgiveness and community and whatnot. The God that the Christian right is talking about is a label on the concept of fate as being a cold, unfeeling universe that just meets out punishment and rewards regardless.
So how would one approach a fascist, aside from, like, I mean, in terms of how people approach fascism and this whole archetype of a strong, unfeeling person, how are liberals approaching this kind of a I don't know what to call it, this kind of archetype in America right now? Like how would, as opposed to, and what does it make any difference? Is it, is it doing anything to stem that archetype from growing?
Well, I think that is the social character, if you will. If you're going to try and change people, if you're going to try and make people think differently, that is more of a long-term project, I think, because there are so many ingrained rituals of harshness and disconnection in American daily life that I think condition people for this way of thinking, but it is by no means the American social character. I think there's a division, right? You have some people who follow that kind of ethic and others who don't. But that alone, you can't.
Do you think liberals understand that, the MAGA? No, so that's kind of what my question was.
No, I mean, my basic assumption is that liberals don't understand anything, and that's a whole nother thing. I'm polemicizing here, of course, but I mean, what I've talked about so far is just sort of basic material, right? So you have, on the one hand, the worldview, then you have the political program, then you have a, how would you call that? Like a psychological mode of being, that neither of these things in and of themselves alone define fascism. It is always a combination thereof. And then some. So there's also philosophical commitment, like, for instance, the rejection of socialism and liberalism, and that entire modernity that starts with the age of revolution. This in direct contradiction to the 1776 cult among the American right. They somehow seem to think that this was the first fascist uprising. But of course, then again, they also, when they say freedom, what they're talking about is the freedom to do things to people they don't like.
Yeah.
Rather than freedom from, say, a feudal oppressor who doesn't feel the need to justify his decisions by popular consent. So that's kind of a misreading of 1776. But the ultimate key to understanding fascism is that it doesn't, because you might think, oh, it's just people being evil or being screwed up in the head or whatever, or drawing the wrong conclusions from observing the world. But there's another component to it where it has a function, and the function of fascism is and has always been to solidify the rule of capital over society. And that is because capital exists in tension, because with many of the fundamental assumptions of liberalism, notwithstanding the fact that some of the owners of capital in the 19th century were liberals and revolutionaries who fought for constitutions and even for democracy, still, once you have developed capitalism, the primary idea is to maximize profit. And the more barriers to that you have, you want to get rid of them. I mean, there's that whole notion of deregulation. You don't want anybody telling you what to do with your property. In the small scale where people say, I don't want people telling me that I can't use my gun, or I have to use these kinds of light bulbs. But of course, the big question is, what do you do if you have the property in the means of production? You own a big corporation, you own a bank, you own an apartment building. Who tells you what you can and cannot do? The one thing is the law, and so deregulation is one component of it. But the other is stuff that with Trump people talked about, like morality, norms, and customs. Stuff that is not written down in the laws, because most ordinary, decent people don't do that kind of stuff. It's simply the unwritten rules of civilized society. What shapes those are these ideologies that are these systems of ideas that have shaped our modern world. One is liberalism and the assumption that it shares with the other major influence, which is Christianity, that the individual has inalienable rights and an inherent worth. So Christianity and liberalism, although of course you get culture wars between the two in the 19th century, nevertheless belong to the same worldview that value the human individual. And so then, socialism spins further from both these sources to say that in order to allow the individual to fully realize their potential and to live a life in dignity, you need individuals to come together collectively and organize the way they produce and consume and exchange things in society. So in other words, you can't leave the question of what people do with factories, with money, with commodities, with trade, to the whim of individuals who happen to be rich. But capital wants that. So capital is in a tension between its own interest in profit on the one hand, and the ideas of liberalism and Christianity that might tell people that it's not right to do this, that it is amoral to do this. So if fascism can come along and say, not only are we going to use the power of government to outlaw liberal and leftist parties, to crush the unions, to outlaw organizing a union, but we're also going to prime people, to recondition people to ditch all these traditional assumptions about the value of humanity and the limits to what you can do to humans, tools for a purpose of making profit, the better. So once you get to German army units overrunning Eastern Europe, slaughtering populations, shooting partisans, that exists in a context where for many decades the German public has been primed to look at Slavic people who live there as subhuman, people who are very much like the ideology of anti-Native American ideas, or
Mhm.
the ideology of anti-Mexican ideas. Like whoever the United States took land from, usually you get the accompanying idea that, oh, but these are people who didn't make proper use of the land. They let all the good stuff go to waste because they don't have that kind of work ethic that we do. So that is the same idea governs the anti-Slavic racism of German nationalism. So when the German armies went into the East, where most of these millions of people were slaughtered, the 6 million Jews were part of that, they went there already with this assumption. These are less than humans. They inhabit land that is rightfully ours. They're good really as slave labor only. And if not even that, they can be butchered with impunity.
Mm-hmm.
But that isn't just for sport. It is not just out of meanness, but it is because German capital and the German educated middle class had long cultivated this notion that Germans are a people without space and that you need space to thrive and that all wealth depends on having the land and the resources, the oil, the forests, the wheat, or whatever, of these steppes of Eastern Europe, all the way to the Ural Mountains and to the Caucasus and whatnot. So that is rightfully ours because the people who live there are inferior and they're not doing anything with it. So this is a capitalist project of expansion, of colonization, of subjugation and exploitation, which no democratic state, no state where you have the ability of people to speak to others' conscience and say you can't do that to other humans would allow. And this is sort of a preview. It's an overture. You get riffs on the themes that are going to be developed in more detail as we look at them one by one.
Okay, so that's really interesting. So basically, it sounds like the model for fascism is it has capitalist properties as a necessary trait of fascism, as well as patriarchal ideologies mixed into it, and those are needed for it to function. The
as well as race.
Yes, and it seems like the whole idea of this, of their version of an ideal person is someone who is powerful, who is unfeeling, and who conquers. And those are seen as good, positive traits to have. And so yes, thank you. So we will. Sorry, my cat is like rolling around the ground.
I saw an ear poke up here and there on occasion. Yeah. So